Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
It's good to be here.
We have a formidable lineup today. 10 stories that, on the surface, they feel pretty disparate. We're going from the fine print of India's fiscal math all the way to mummified cheetahs in Saudi Arabia.
Right. It's quite a rage.
But when you look closer, they all seem to point toward this one single theme, the friction between, let's say, legacy systems and this necessary evolution that's happening.
I see that.
You see it everywhere, whether it's the U.S. nuclear umbrella, the business model of these giant legal firms, or even the Indian education system. It feels like the old ways are just, creaking under the pressure.
That is absolutely the through line. We're seeing these deep structural shifts. And it's not just news in the daily sense. It's the sound of gears grinding as the world really tries to shift into a new phase, especially looking at 2026 and beyond.
Well, let's start right there, in the engine room of that shift. The union budget. The first article is the editorial's take on India's fiscal roadmap toward Viksit Bharat 2047. I've been looking at these numbers and, well, while the government is projecting confidence, the underlying mechanics, they seem to be losing a bit of torque.
I think that's a good way to put it.
The big headline is this restructuring of expenditure, moving away from revenue spending and towards capital expenditure.
Right. And on paper, that looks like very responsible governance. I mean, it's what you want to see.
Of course.
If you look at the trajectory since, say, 2014-15, revenue expenditure, which is really the money you burn on salaries, subsidies, just keeping the lights on.
The operational costs.
Exactly. That has dropped from about 88% of the total budget to now, in the 2026-27 outlook, around 77%. That frees up a lot of fiscal space. The clear intention is to channel that saving into capital expenditure, or CapEx.
Building assets, highways, power plants, things that last. But this is where the math starts to get a little sticky for me. We've relied so heavily on CapEx to drive GDP growth, especially post-COVID. The multiplier effect is huge.
It is. The government's own estimates suggest that for every single rupee you spend on infrastructure, you get something like 2.5 to maybe 4.5 rupees of economic activity back in the medium term.
Which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But the editorial points out that the growth rate of the spending is, well, it's collapsing.
It's a huge slowdown. I mean, we're coming down from a peak of over 28%.
28%.
Down to a budget at 11.5%.
And that 11.5% is a nominal figure, isn't it?
It is. So when you strip out inflation, when you look at it in real terms, it's barely moving the needle relative to the GDP. It really suggests the government is tapping the brakes.
So the big question then becomes, can the private sector step on the gas? We've been waiting for this private investment cycle to really kick in for years now.
We have. And if the government withdraws that stimulus right now, and the private sector is still cautious, well, you risk a period of stagnation. That's the real danger here.
It feels like they don't have much of a choice, though. The debt servicing costs they're just astronomical.
They are.
I was reading that nearly 40% of all revenue receipts are completely swallowed up by interest payments alone.
40%. It's a massive drag on the entire economy. It's hard to even talk about building a developed India when 40 cents of every single tax dollar is just paying for the past, not the future.
It's a vicious cycle, right?
It absolutely is. To pay that debt, you need really robust tax revenue. But the tax buoyancy, which is, how responsive your tax collection is to GDP growth, is currently at 0.8.
And you want that to be above 1.
In a developing economy, you absolutely want it above 1.
Yeah.
You want your tax revenue to grow faster than your economy. At 0.8, your revenue is lagging. So if GST collections and corporate tax don't outperform, the government has to borrow more to bridge that gap.
Which increases the interest burden.
Which then reduces the money available for CapEx. And the cycle just continues.
And the states, they're just caught right in the middle of this. The 16th Finance Commission kept their share at 41%, which on the surface looks stable.
But it's a bit misleading. By removing the revenue deficit grants, the actual cash transfer going to the states is lower.
So it's a cut, effectively.
It is. Now, you could argue it forces states to be more fiscally disciplined, sure, but it also squeezes their ability to fund really critical things like health and education, which are state subjects. You just can't achieve Viksit Bharat with shiny new highways but underfunded schools. The roadmap is there, but the fuel, the money, it feels like it's running dangerously low.
Okay, so speaking of economic roadmaps, let's pivot to our second article. While the domestic engine might be sputtering a bit, the international trade engine seems to be getting a massive turbo boost. The editorial on the India-U.S. strategic trade deal calls it an expressway.
It really is a significant breakthrough. I mean, we've seen a whole flurry of deals recently with IFTA, the UK, the EU, but the US is the big
It's our
prize,
largest export destination.
by far. And the headline here is the tariff reduction. The U.S. is slashing duties on Indian goods from these really high peaks of, say, 50% down to roughly 18%.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. 18% is obviously great compared to 50, but is it enough? I mean, countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh have had favorable access for years. They have really entrenched supply chains. Does this tariff cut actually give India a real competitive edge, or are we just, playing catch up?
That's a fair question. It's probably a bit of both. But you have to look at the specific sectors that are involved here. This deal really targets labor-intensive industries: apparel, gems and jewelry, marine products.
Right, where margins are everything.
They're razor thin.
Yeah.
So a drop from 50% to 18% absolutely restores price competitiveness. It might not instantly displace Vietnam, but you have to combine it with the China Plus One strategy, where U.S. buyers are actively, desperately looking for alternatives to Beijing. This puts India right back on the menu.
So it's not so much giving us an advantage as it is removing the penalty of doing business with India.
That's a perfect way to phrase it, exactly. But the editorial argues that the real value here isn't just about selling more shirts or more shrimp. It's the strategic reset this represents.
Clearing the decks, is that the idea?
That's it. Tariffs are a constant source of friction. They're political irritants. By resolving this big, thorny issue, Washington and New Delhi are basically clearing the decks.
For what, though? What's the next step?
For the harder stuff. We're talking about defense technology transfers, high-tech manufacturing, semiconductor supply chains. These things require deep regulatory trust.
Yeah, you can't share jet engine technology with a country you're in the middle of a trade war with.
You just can't. This deal signals that the U.S. sees India not just as a market anymore, but as a long-term structural ally against Chinese dominance in the Indo-Pacific. It's a big, big deal.
So trust is the currency there. But while that trust seems to be building in the Indo-Pacific, our third article suggests it's completely fracturing across the Atlantic.
Yes, a very different story.
The opinion piece, The Fractured Shield, it paints a really grim picture of NATO and nuclear deterrence. The argument is that the erratic behavior of the U.S., specifically mentioning the Trump administration's bizarre attempt to buy Greenland.
I know, it still sounds comical.
It does.
Yeah.
But that and the bullying of Denmark has caused what the author calls permanent damage.
It might sound funny, buying Greenland, but it exposed a really transactional view of alliances that absolutely terrified Europe.
Yeah.
The whole core of NATO is Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all.
And that relies on absolute trust.
Absolute trust that the U.S. would, in the final analysis, trade New York for Paris in a nuclear exchange.
Right.
If that trust wavers even slightly, the shield cracks.
The author brings up this really interesting concept, this shift from certainty to uncertainty.
This is so crucial to understanding modern nuclear strategy. During the Cold War, we had certainty, we had mutual assured destruction. Everyone knew where the red lines were. They were bright and they were clear.
Right.
Today, we're moving toward a state of uncertainty. It's a model that's actually quite similar to what we saw between India and Pakistan back in the 80s and 90s.
You're talking about the salami slicing tactic.
Exactly that. Pakistan realized it could sponsor low-level terrorism or small border incursions, slicing the salami just thin enough without triggering a full-blown Indian nuclear response. The uncertainty of will they or won't they actually allowed for more conventional conflict.
And the article is arguing that Europe is entering that same phase. Russia is testing the boundaries, basically banking on the uncertainty of the American response.
That's the core argument.
And the war in Ukraine has just turned all the conventional wisdom on its head. I mean, we used to think, if you don't have nukes, you get bullied. Ukraine gave up its nukes in the 90s, and yet it's held off a nuclear superpower.
That is the Ukraine paradox. It's a huge lesson. It proved that a non-nuclear state can fight a nuclear state and survive, but only if it has enough conventional firepower and resilience.
It challenges that core assumption that every nation needs its own bomb to be safe.
It does. But the fear is still there, and it's driving a new arms race. You see China sprinting to expand its arsenal, adding 100 warheads a year. The UK is increasing its stockpiles. And with the New START treaty expiring on February 5th, guardrails are just coming off.
which leaves Europe with this massive existential question. Can they build a security architecture that doesn't rely on the whim of whoever happens to be sitting in the White House? That is a generational challenge.
A huge one.
Now let's move from the security of nations to the security of livelihoods. Article 4 highlights the crisis of contract teachers in India.
And this connects right back to our first topic on fiscal deficits.
How so?
Well, why do states hire contract teachers in the first place? It's because they're broke. It's an economic trap. A regular teacher comes with a full salary, with benefits, and crucially, a pension liability.
Right.
A contract teacher does the exact same work for maybe a quarter of the cost and with zero long-term liability for the state.
It's the Uberization of the education system.
That's a good way of looking at it, yes. But the scale is just massive. We're talking about 16 lakh teachers. That's 16% of the entire workforce.
16%. Wow.
And in some states like Jharkhand or Mizoram, it's over 30%. The opinion piece argues that this short-term fiscal fix is creating a long-term educational disaster. You simply cannot build a quality education system on a workforce that is underpaid, insecure, and completely demoralized.
And it seems the courts are finally starting to step in. That Punjab and Haryana High Court ruling seems pretty significant.
It is. They effectively said you can't keep someone on a temporary contract for 10 years. That's a contradiction in terms. The label has to mean something.
It creates a legal precedent then.
Yes, a precedent against the misuse of these contractual labels. But the states will fight this, tooth and nail, because of the pension issue. The whole shift from the old pension scheme to the new pension scheme is already a political hot potato.
So regularizing millions of teachers would just...
It would blow a hole in state budgets that are already incredibly fragile, as we discussed with those Finance Commission cuts.
So the states are stuck. They're caught between a legal mandate to treat their workers fairly and a fiscal mandate to balance the books. It's just gridlock.
Complete gridlock.
Okay, let's shift gears completely. From the classroom to the desert caves of Saudi Arabia. Article 5 in the science section is absolutely fascinating. They've found mummified cheetahs.
It's a remarkable find, really. In the Laga Cave network, the extreme dryness of the desert just acted as a natural preservative, and they found specimens ranging from 4,000 years old.
4,000?
To just 100 years old. So it confirms that cheetahs were roaming the Arabian Peninsula much more recently than we thought.
But the real story here isn't the mummies themselves, it's the DNA, right? Saudi Arabia wants to rewild the desert, bring the cheetahs back.
They do, but the genetic analysis threw a huge curveball. These Arabian cheetahs, it turns out, weren't related to the Asiatic cheetahs that we find in Iran or that historically were in India.
So where did they come from?
They're genetically closest to the West African subspecies.
Which complicates everything.
Completely. Biogeography tells us that species migrate and drift genetically over millennia. The old assumption was that there was this continuous belt of Asiatic cheetahs stretching from India through Iran all the way to Arabia.
And this DNA evidence breaks that link.
It shatters it. It implies that the Arabian population was actually an extension of the African population moving north, not the Asian one moving west.
So if Saudi Arabia wants to reintroduce them, they shouldn't be looking to Iran or India. They need to go to West Africa. But isn't that incredibly risky? You're taking an animal adapted to the savanna and just dropping it into the hyper-arid Arabian desert.
That is the huge ecological risk. And it's not just about the heat, it's about prey density. The expert cited in the article, Ravi Chellam, points out that cheetahs are low-density predators. They need massive, massive territories.
How massive are we talking?
We're talking something like 100,000 square kilometers of protected contiguous space to sustain a viable population without inbreeding.
And do they even have that kind of space without any human interference?
That's the core of the skepticism. Between oil infrastructure, highways, and human settlements, finding a block of land that size is nearly impossible.
It sounds a lot like the challenges India's facing with our own Project Cheetah.
It mirrors it exactly. We love the idea of rewilding. It's romantic, it's nationalistic, but the biological reality of habitat fragmentation usually means it becomes a very, very expensive failure.
Okay, from the biological definition of a species to the legal definition of discrimination. Article 6 takes us to the Supreme Court of India. It's a text and context piece on university equity regulations. This one is Well, that's a heavy one.
It is.
The UGC tried to introduce new rules in 2026 to curb caste discrimination, but the Supreme Court has put a stay on them.
The core of this dispute, it really boils down to the granularity of law.
Yeah.
The UGC's 2026 regulations, they attempted to define caste-based discrimination as a specific, separate offense, something distinct from general harassment or bullying.
Why is that distinction so necessary? I mean, isn't discrimination just discrimination at the end of the day?
Well, that's the formal equality argument, that you should treat everyone exactly the same. But the supporters of this new regulation, they argue for something called substantive equality.
What's the difference?
They say that caste discrimination is asymmetric. It doesn't happen to upper caste students in the same way it happens to Dalit or Adivasi students. It's systemic, it's historical, and therefore you need a specific legal tool to address it, much like we have specific laws for sexual harassment.
But the counter-argument, and this is what seemingly swayed the court for now, is that the definition was too broad and it kind of presumed guilt.
Yes. The opponents argue that this specific definition presumed that any conflict between a general category student and a scheduled caste student was automatically discrimination. They felt it stripped the accused of the presumption of innocence. They also cited a lack of safeguards against false complaints.
So it's this classic tension between protecting vulnerable groups and ensuring due process for everyone.
Precisely. And the court staying the order means we're back to the 2012 rules for now, which many activists claim are just toothless.
They're too generic.
Too generic. They don't capture the subtle forms of exclusion like social boycotts or those derogatory comments about merit that the 2026 rules specifically try to codify. So this legal battle it's far from over. It's just paused.
Okay, let's move to another legal battle, this one involving one of the biggest companies in the world. Article 7 discusses the Supreme Court stance on Meta, that's Facebook and WhatsApp. The language being used here is incredibly aggressive.
It really is.
They're not talking about privacy policies anymore. They are using words like coercion and even theft.
This is a potential watershed moment for the whole data as property argument. Justice Badgey introduced a concept he called rent sharing. And the logic is actually simple, but it's revolutionary.
Lay it out for us.
Meta takes your data, which he argues is your property, processes it, and then sells access to advertisers for billions of dollars. So, if they are monetizing your property, why aren't you getting a cut? Why aren't you getting rent?
That just flips the entire internet business model on its head. We've always been told the service is free because we are the product.
Right. But the court is saying, no, you're not just a product, you're a monopoly.
That's the key word, monopoly.
It is. Chief Justice Surya Kant made a really profound point. He said that opting out of WhatsApp in India today is functionally equivalent to opting out of society. You need it for neighborhood groups, for school updates, sometimes even for government services.
So if you cannot leave,
then your consent to share data isn't really voluntary, is it? It's forced. It's coerced.
It reminds me of the old Standard Oil days. When a company basically becomes public infrastructure, it can't operate like a private club anymore.
Exactly. And the court is threatening to dismiss Meta's appeal entirely if they don't stop cross-sharing data between WhatsApp and Facebook immediately. I mean, if this data rent concept gains legal traction, it could destroy the profit margins of every single ad-supported tech company in India.
A huge story to watch. Now, speaking of profit margins and changing times, let's look at the cultural side of things. Article 8 reviews Dan Brown's new book, The Secret of Secrets. And it seems Robert Langdon is back, but he hasn't exactly updated his operating system.
That's a great way to put it. It's a fascinating critique of character stagnation. The reviewer notes that while the world has moved on to these complex, nuanced debates, Robert Langdon is still the same professor of symbology from 2003.
Still running down corridors, explaining history to a younger female sidekick.
He's become a static vehicle for the plot. He doesn't change.
But the theme has shifted, hasn't it? Brown used to be the guy who pitted the church against science. Now it feels like he's trying to merge them.
That's the big philosophical evolution. In Angels and Demons, they were mortal enemies. In this new book, Brown dives into things like non-localized consciousness, which is essentially quantum mysticism. He's arguing that advanced science and ancient spirituality are actually saying the same thing.
So he's tapping into the modern zeitgeist, where science is sometimes treated with an almost religious reverence, or where pseudoscience becomes the new mystery to solve.
That's it, exactly. He's moved from historical conspiracy to scientific conspiracy. But the core criticism remains. While the ideas might be evolving, The storytelling machinery is, well, it's getting rusty.
Well, let's look at a machine that was supposed to print money but is currently jamming. Article 9 covers the obesity drug bubble. We all know Ozempic, Wegovy. Wall Street thought this was an infinite money glitch.
It absolutely was. It was the gold rush of 2024 and 2025. You had analysts predicting a $150 billion market.
But that forecast has just been slashed.
It slashed to $100 billion, or even less. Jeffries thinks it could be as low as $80 billion. The bubble is deflating fast.
Why? Is the demand dropping off?
No, not at all. The demand is still there. But the price is collapsing. It's a classic price war. You've got these giants, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, facing political pressure and the looming threat of generic competition from India and China.
So they're cutting prices to protect their market share.
Drastically.
Yeah.
From over $1,000 a month down to under $300.
But basic economics says if the price goes down, the volume should go up. Shouldn't they make up the difference?
That's the thin ice scenario they're in. To maintain that $150 billion valuation with prices slashed by 70%, they need to increase the number of users by, 300 or 400%. They basically need to put everyone on these drugs, and that's a massive logistical and cultural hurdle.
And there's new technology shifting things, too. I read about oral pills coming out in April.
That's the big wild card. If you could just take a pill instead of doing an injection, adoption could skyrocket and maybe save the market volume. But investors hate this kind of uncertainty. They see the margins compressing, so they're pulling out.
And finally, our 10th article. We talked about data monopolies earlier, but it looks like artificial intelligence is now coming for those data giants. We're seeing a stock market crash for companies like Thomson Reuters and RELX.
This is the first really clear sign of AI just eating the SaaS software as a service business model. These companies, they build empires on selling seats.
Licenses for lawyers to access case law or for researchers to access data.
Exactly. And they had what was called the visibility premium because that revenue was recurring and it was stable. It was predictable.
And then Anthropic and their Claude plugins came along.
Right. And suddenly, if an AI agent can scan the entire legal corpus and draft a perfect summary in seconds for just pennies, why does a law firm need 50 expensive licenses for a database? They might only need one.
So you shift from seat-based pricing to outcome-based pricing.
Exactly. And outcome-based is much, much cheaper and more efficient. The market has suddenly realized that the moat these companies have, their proprietary data, is being bridged by AI synthesis. So investors are dumping the stock because they see that entire subscription model collapsing.
It's just a brutal reminder that in technology, your biggest asset can become your biggest liability almost overnight.
It really connects back to everything we've talked about today. The fiscal deficit, the nuclear deterrence, the teacher contracts. It's all about the massive cost of maintaining these legacy systems in a world that is rapidly and sometimes brutally rewriting the rules.
A sobering but very necessary perspective. That brings us to the end of our drive today.
Indeed it does.
Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.